Okay, everybody. We should get started because I want to leave time for questions. My name is Rick Hills. I teach here at NYU, and we're going to talk about historic preservation in New York City, which is an exciting and sometimes passionately angry topic if you go to some hearings. We have some experts here who can really shed light on the topic. Now, the way we're going to proceed is that I'm first just going to give you some data acting as a sock puppet for the Furman Institute. The Furman Institute provides lots of data, and I'm going to show you some in convenient form. I'm on the board of the Furman Institute, and so I'm an appropriate sock puppet. But it was not produced by me, and I don't want to take credit for it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to our four experts, starting with Valerie to my left, Claudette to my right, Simeon to my far right, and then David to my far left. And what we're going to talk about is how how landmarking and historic preservation work, districting, landmarking, preservation. Preservation from the advocate's point of view, Claudette's going to talk about recent controversies and efforts to create a new historic district and what it means to do that before the LPC. Simeon's going to talk about recent controversies about how the law in general applies, and especially the question of whether excessive procedural delay in the law can be solved through legislative reform. David's going to talk about the big picture, about how the preservation system fits in with the zoning resolution and land use regulation generally. Now, just to say a few words about people, I don't want to spend a lot of time because time is short. Valerie Naut Kramer-Levin is sort of an in-the-trenches expert. She was general counsel for 4 years at LPC. So you cannot possibly be in a position to know more about how the system works as a legal, political policy matter than being in that position. Claudette has been at the Historic Preservation Society of Bed-Stuy, right? And so she has been in the trenches doing historic preservation at sort of the individual case level. Nobody knows more about community organizing and understanding how a neighborhood should be appraised through this administrative process than Claudette. David has been executive director of the HDC.
No, I'm Simeon.
Simeon, no, I know, sorry. Simeon is executive director of HDC. And so he is going to give you the bird's eye perspective on citywide controversies about how that system works. And David is a veteran, 15 years as general counsel on the Planning Commission, now at Fried Frank, but really a public sector, public service veteran. When I first came to New York City, people would say, for years, you're teaching land use, you got to talk to David. David's the only guy to talk to. And finally, he's been coming to my classes, basically taking me off the hook because we have real expertise there. So it's wonderful that he's here to give you the land use perspective. Now, what I'm supposed to do is click here, and I want to make sure that the clicks work with my power, so I can only see it on my little iPad. But I want to just give you a quick overview of how important this issue is. So, good. And so if you look at this map, you might say, hey, there's not that many historic districts. There's little tiny spots in New York. If you look at the red ones and the orange ones, those are the recent ones. The blue ones, that's back in the Lindsay years, more far away in time, but it doesn't look like there's that many. But, look again. If you look at the number of districts and extensions added by years, to your right, see those brown ones? That's the Bloomberg years on the right side of the slide. That's a lot. Now, that's misleading, of course, because that's just showing you the absolute number of extensions. One of those extensions could just be one building, so big deal. But if you go to the next slide, you can see if you look at the count. What? Oh, whoop, okay, how did that work? There we go. If you look at this slide, you can see that the count of lots and the percent of city lots has been rising steadily. The left side gives you the count, the right side gives you the percent, and you can see we're rising closely past 3% over there. That's 3% significant. And so there's a steady increase. It's increasing year to year. And if we look at it at a different measurement, square footage, again, you see a steady increase of square footage and percent of city lot area in historic districts. Now, you might say, well, still, if I look at the right side of that slide, we're only up to 2.5%. What's the big deal? 2.5%, who cares? But look at where they're concentrated. Those big columns there, that's Brooklyn and Manhattan. Primo real estate. So this is high value property. And if you look at the square footage of lot area in historic districts by borough, again, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and increasingly Queens, you're getting up to 50 million square feet of real estate in Manhattan. So if we look at the percentages in Manhattan, the percentages are much higher. They're getting into the 2-digit figure. Now here are individual landmarks. Keep in mind, it's always important to keep in mind the basic division between landmarking and districting. A landmark applies to an individual structure. Districts apply to neighborhoods. Either of them can preserve historic character. But districts obviously, cover much more land at a go, except that an extension of a district can be very small, and a landmarking of a building could be very big, because a building could be big. Now, here's another picture here, which gives you the count and percentage of city lots with an individual or interior designation by year. So again, you see a rise in landmarking. Individual structures are being landmarked. In my neighborhood in Brooklyn, a bunch of large apartment buildings, office buildings in downtown Brooklyn were recently landmarked. If you look at the count of lots covered by individual or interior designations, these are landmarkings, Manhattan clearly dwarfs everything else. No surprise there, Manhattan is the oldest urbanized area, as you're gonna have more urban structures in Manhattan. But still, we're talking primo real estate in terms of value and in terms of proximity to places where people work. So if you're trying to minimize commute times by building new housing, designations in Manhattan, could be interesting. Now, I have 3 questions which I want to ask all of the panelists, and they're questions that we're going to address at the end, but I've invited them to discuss them at any point during their presentations, if they wish. And my questions are, first, historic preservation has benefits, aesthetic, historical, cultural benefits. But it also has costs. A recent article by Ed Glazer with some Furman people as well. Vicki Bean, our own Vicki Bean, was an author before she joined the city government. She didn't participate at all after she joined the city government. But this study from 2014 indicates that a significant amount of housing is lost as a result of historic preservation. And as housing area is lost because a site is shrink-wrapped so that you can't build on top of it, that'll raise rents elsewhere. Ed Glazer is famous. He's an economist up at Harvard. He's famous for doing some fairly astute measurements that have convinced at least a lot of us that a major reason why large cities like New York, San Francisco, Boston, Chicago are unaffordable is because of regulatory restrictions. And landmarking is one of those restrictions. Historic districts are one of those restrictions. So one question I have for everybody is, how are the costs of housing preservation in terms of increased rents and restrictions on housing supply balanced against the benefits? Is there a mechanism for doing that in the process? The second question is related to the first. The legal standards for designating a district or an individual structure is basically, is there special historical or aesthetic interest? That's it. That's the law. That's not a terribly precise standard. In my land use class and also when I teach LegReg, I do ask my students whether that violates the non-delegation doctrine. Is it essentially turning over vast discretionary authority to an administrative agency? But whatever you think of that standard, the question I want to ask is that standard a legal limit that can be policed by courts or through the political process so it's not captured by neighborhood groups who use the landmarking or the districting process for reasons other than preservation? That is to say, they just don't want anything built nearby, or they don't want like tall buildings. Maybe they don't want housing nearby because they just want a less dense neighborhood. Those are not legitimate purposes for historical preservation, but they nevertheless could be purposes that motivate some of the neighbors to use this restrictive tool. So that's my second question. How does the law constrain NIMBYism, neighbors who don't want something in their backyard? And my third question is, the Landmarks Preservation Commission and the New York Administrative Code that defines the legal standards for historic preservation are embedded in a larger legal framework. The zoning resolution, subdivision rules, the city's general laws. How does the city as a whole, looking outside just the LPC, how does the Planning Commission, how does council balance the value of historical preservation using these other laws? So looking at preservation in context, is there some way that, for instance, housing can be brought into the mix? And one mechanism I especially want to ask David about is whether the Planning Commission can take into account these historic districts that I've just shown you pictures of and say, well, given that we've districted large parts of New York, should we increase densities in the non-designated areas sort of informal transfer of development rights. Is that a practical possibility? Is that something that the Planning Commission does? To make sure that we maintain housing as we maintain areas of historic interest. So those are my 3 big policy questions. I hope we can talk about them generally. And if anybody wants to talk about them during their presentations, that would be great. But without further ado, I want to turn to Valerie to give us the details, the nitty-gritty on how this legal system works. Now, Valerie, this clicker will help you go through the slides, and they will shout out to you when you've gotten to your deck.
Do I have it? Can you, you don't have that on your iPad?
Oh, wait, hold on. Do I? Yes, I do. Let's do
Okay,
it.
that might be helpful. Good afternoon. Really, we wanted to sort
You'll
of...
want to go one more, by the way,
Oh, one
because
more.
I left out the last slide.
Oh, okay. There. We wanted to give you an overview of the Landmarks Preservation Commission as an agency. It is a city agency. It was established in 1965, and its purpose is to really designate and regulate 4 types of landmarks: individual landmarks, interior landmarks, historic districts, and scenic landmarks. At the time the law was enacted, it was predicated on the generic municipal police power. Subsequently, the New York State Legislature enacted enabling legislation that specifically allowed municipalities the power to designate and regulate for historic preservation. We've sort of gone through the number of landmarks and historic districts. I mean, it's obviously increasing, and basically, once a building or a historic district is designated, it's really designated in perpetuity. There's not really a mechanism to de-designate something that's widely available unless the building burns down or is destroyed. The commission has sort of 2 parts. Like the city planning, it has a commission that's 11 commissioners appointed by the mayor for staggered terms. They have to have architects, a historian, a representative of each borough, a realtor, and everybody except the chair is unpaid. So they're really volunteers. So this is sort of the percentage of landmarked. Actually, you can sort of see, this was a real estate board slide, so it has a certain bias, but it states that 27% of all the properties in Manhattan are landmarked, which sort of shows the concentration. The commissioners are unpaid except for the chair. There is a professional staff at the Landmarks Commission. I think it's up to about 90 people now. It's divided really as an agency into sort of 2 sections. One is the research department, which is really in charge of the designation process, sort of the research leading up to designation. And then there's a preservation department, which really regulates all of the landmarks. In terms of the jurisdiction of landmarks, it only has power over the buildings and the districts that have been designated. It is not entitled to exercise zoning powers, to regulate the height or bulk of buildings, density, and use. And the last is a particularly important distinction, because sometimes people who would like to designate things really want to preserve the use, but in fact all landmarks does is preserve the building. Absent a hardship application, the commission can't consider the economic effects of designation. It doesn't regulate light, air, or people's private views. There are 4 types of landmarks. There are individual landmarks, and that's usually a building, but it can also be a structure like the Brooklyn Bridge. Under the law, it has to have a special character or a historical or aesthetic interest or value as part of the development, heritage, or cultural characteristics of the city, state, or nation. The historic district is supposed to have a sense of place. It's supposed to represent one or more periods of styles of architecture and constitute a distinct section of the city. Within a historic district, the geographical boundaries, all buildings and vacant lots are regulated by the commission. An interior landmark has really the same standard as an individual landmark. It has to be customarily open and accessible to the public. Examples of interior landmarks are the Chrysler Building lobby. Many of the Broadway theaters are interior landmarks, the Four Seasons restaurant, the Rainbow Room. Again, as part of sort of related to the use, even though they have to be customarily accessible to the public in order to be designated, landmarks does not have any power to require that they continue to be open to the public. And scenic landmarks have to be city-owned, so that's like Central Park, Prospect Park. We wanted to go, actually this is, I'm not quite sure where we are here. The designation process, is that back?
Yeah, you'll have to go back.
Okay. Okay. So there's really sort of two parts of the designation process. There is sort of the internal agency consideration, and then there is the formal process of designation. Landmarks can really designate on its own initiative or in response to requests for evaluations, which can be submitted by any member of the public. I mean, you can go on the Landmarks website, you can find a request for evaluation, and you can submit it. The commission has the policy of reaching out to owners of buildings, either within the historic district or individual landmarks that it's considered designating, to discuss the agency's interest, but owner consent is not required. So landmarks can go ahead even if everybody is opposed, and many owners are opposed because they don't want to be regulated. Landmarks cannot be compelled to calendar or hold a hearing on a proposed landmark or a historic district. Once the commission as an agency has decided to proceed with the landmark or district, they vote to calendar it at a public meeting. There's a subsequent public hearing. Anyone can testify in favor or opposed to the district. Landmarks will close the public hearing. There is a designation report that's drafted that describes the property being designated and the reasons for designation. When the commission first started, these reports were maybe a page or two. Now they can be hundreds of pages for a district and at least 50 for an individual landmark. So they go into exhaustive detail. And the report and the photographs are really key tools for determining how the building gets regulated in the future. But landmarks will then close the public hearing and then vote to designate at a public meeting. And the designation is effective upon the commission vote. 6 of the 11 commissioners have to vote to designate. As a practical matter, most things that come to a public hearing are designated. The commission turns down very few buildings or districts that come that far. What's designated is both the improvement and a landmark site, which is usually the tax lot. Sometimes it's less than the tax lot. And landmark's jurisdiction extends to anything that happens on the landmark site, above, below. So that is why you'll see sometimes proposals to cantilever a building over a landmark will go to landmarks for a public hearing. The City Planning Commission is sent copies of designation, submits reports to the City Council, and the City Council is able to modify or rescind designations. Although again, this does not happen that frequently, and the designation is effective immediately upon the landmarks vote. There's 2 basic obligations on a landmark owner. You have to keep your property in good repair, and you have to get landmarks approval before you work on your building or on the landmark site. Good repair doesn't mean you have to restore them or keep them in pristine condition, but you do have to keep them structurally sound, watertight, and not let important cornices or details fall off the building. And in order to do any work on a landmark, you have to go to the commission and get a permit before you start the work or before the Department of Buildings will issue a permit. By law, the Department of Buildings can't issue a permit until Landmarks has first approved the work. And this also means, applies to the Board of Standards and Appeals and the City Planning Commission. The Landmarks approval comes first, even if you need another discretionary land use approval. There are about, I think currently Landmarks is issuing about 9,000 permits every year. There are three different kinds of approvals: certificates of no effect, permits for minor work. I don't even know if we're there. Okay.
Oh, I guess
Well,
one more.
Tim, sorry. There's staff level permits or certificates of no effect, permit for minor work. That's 95% of the permits that Landmarks issues. That's either for work that's very minor or conforms to Landmarks rules. The permits, the applications that you may read about on YIMBY or in the newspaper are usually are permits that come to a public hearing. That's a certificate of appropriateness. And that's a small percentage of the permits, but it requires a lot of attention. And usually like demolition, building a new building in a historic district, adding a visible rooftop addition or changing the storefronts. That's all the type of work that might have to go to a public hearing. And when it goes to a public hearing, it's referred first to the community board for an advisory recommendation, and then it comes to the commission for a public hearing, and at least 6 of the commissioners have to approve to issue the permit. So that's sort of a brief overview of the process. Landmarks does have some enforcement powers that are regulated primarily through the Environmental Control Board.
Well, thank you so much. It's really very helpful. And what I want to do is turn to Claudette. Now, Claudette, I actually have your slide. You have some
I don't have
You don't have slides.
I'm
Bless your
slideless.
heart. You're slideless, but that you're all the more welcome. So Claudette's just going to talk about, how this whole system that was just described works on the ground. So Claudette.
Good afternoon. I am from Bedford-Stuyvesant. Bedford-Stuyvesant now has 3. Well, we have the Stuyvesant Heights Extension, Stuyvesant Heights Historic District, which was designated in 1973. This is in the early days of preservation. At that time, I think LPC was Landmarks Preservation Commission, was sort of instigating the designation process within the neighborhoods. It's the second historic district in Brooklyn after Brooklyn Heights. In 2010, the district, 2012, the district was expanded. We also have the Allison Agincourt Historic District, a small 2-block cul-de-sac, 32 buildings, designated in 2009. And we have a Magnolia grandiflora, I think the only designated tree in New York City. The only living designated tree in New York City. So the story of the tree was brought up from the Carolinas or somewhere in the South and planted in Bedford-Stuyvesant. At the time, the city was doing a lot of urban renewal in Bedford-Stuyvesant, which meant tearing down rows and rows of brownstones, building projects and other projects they were doing. What are those other buildings called?
Not the Hunterfly Road.
Not the Hunterfly. Well, we also have the Hunterfly Road, which is actually technically in Crown Heights. Weeksville, which is sort of border Bed-Stuy Crown Heights, which is a settlement, an old free Negroes, because that's what they were, free Negro settlement from the 1800s. So the grandiflora, the women who decide that they can't tear down this tree because, first of all, it's not supposed to live in this northern climate. So that's how we have the only living tree in the neighborhood. The current designation efforts in Bedford-Stuyvesant started about 2007 as Agate and Alex Court and with the Bedford Historic District. For a lot of us in Bed-Stuy, we did not realize that designation was actually a community-driven process. In 1995, there was a movement to expand the Stuyvesant Heights Historic District, and it was calendared but never designated because of the contention among community residents, the community board, the city council person at the time, but there was no actual grassroots effort and on-the-ground educational effort with the neighbors for that process. Allison Agate Court, a little block built by one builder, 32 homes, and their efforts started because there's a wall that forms a cul-de-sac for those 2 blocks. And within those 2 blocks, there are people who've been living there since the mid-30s when African Americans started moving into Bedford-Stuyvesant. And it's a community. So in tearing, a developer bought this vacant lot that was behind the two blocks and decided to tear down the wall and make it a through street. And they opposed that. So they actually got an injunction against the developer to tear down the wall, and they worked to get the 2 blocks designated. At the same time, on my side, I was Block Association president at the time, and we were having this conversation and not really understanding the process. And one of our elder neighbors sort of remembered the 1993 effort and said, why don't we do this? Why don't we get our block designated? We went to the community board, and there were just all these things happening at the same time. The community board started a landmarks committee. One of our neighbors happened to know somebody who was working on historic designation in Crown Heights. Crown Heights folks came over, spoke to us a bunch of times, talked to us about how they did the process, and introduced us to Simeon. Through Simeon, we actually learned more about the process, and we learned that the Landmarks Preservation Commission had actually done a survey of Bedford-Stuyvesant back in the early 1970s, and our block was part of a district, we'll call it a district, that they drew. So for us, we now sort of went actually block to block within that district and said, do you know who the Block Association president is? Because that's how we do things. Oh yeah, she lives in that, and we'd go knock on her door and say, hi, you know, we're from around the corner. We want to designate our block, and we found that your block is part of this proposed district. Do you think your block would be interested? So that's how we started. We got all the blocks together, and then when we started the process, we looked around, we looked at what Crown Heights was doing, we looked at what folks in Greenwich Village was doing, we looked at what the folks on the Upper West Side were doing, and we sort of took all that together and created a roadmap for Bedford-Stuyvesant. The first thing that we did was we pulled every single homeowner's name within that proposed district from the City Department of Finance and Taxation, which is the same agency that LPC would get the names from. And we wanted everyone to know that we wanted to do this process. We sent a mailing out to about roughly 450 homeowners. Our first meeting, we had over 150 people. Most of them were in favor. Throughout this is 2007, we will be going to our city council hearing, which is the final part of designation, next Thursday. So this has been a 7-year effort. For us, the community at large was supportive. When we found that people had negative impressions about landmarks preservation, it came from the fact that they thought maybe landmarks preservation would affect the interior of their houses, what they could do in their house, what kind of work they could do on the inside of their house. We never really had concerns about cost, because for the most part, most of our neighbors are not doing anything to their houses. They change their windows, some might paint, but if you walk through Bed-Stuy, you'll see that, especially in the Bedford district, most of the houses, if you remove the cars, most of the houses look exactly the way they did in 1896. A lot of movies are filmed in Bed-Stuy for that. If anybody's watched The Knick is filmed in Bed-Stuy, part of it in Friend's house because it's completely restored. But that's how, you know, they took the cars out and they put in some 18th century light posts. They had, okay, one guy, they made him take the awning off his house. But other than that, the Knick just came in and shot, okay, they did throw some gravel on the street as well. But the Knick came in and shot in Bed-Stuy because Bed-Stuy looks like it did in 1896. Where we started getting pressure was from out from the Real Estate Board of New York. And their candidate for city council, along with some other folks, decided to sort of wage a campaign against designation in Bedford-Stuyvesant. Again, they took our strategy. Bedford-Stuyvesant is a people-to-people sort of community. If I want my neighbor to do something, I don't send her an email. I knock on her door. I have a talk. We are a stoop-sitting community. So we sit on our stoops. We talk about things on our stoops. It's also a neighborhood full of block association. Bedford-Stuyvesant has some of the oldest, longest-running block associations in the country. On this issue, just from the turnout of our block association meetings, on a regular basis, a block association meeting, we'd have 10, tops 20 people if we're planning the block party. And we're looking at blocks where you have anywhere from 60 to 80 houses. For the meetings that we were having at the block association on preservation, we were having 50 to 60 people turning out. That's how great the interest was in preservation. And the interest was not so much because we did not want a big building next to us, because there was no place to build a big building next to us. A lot of it had to do with pride in the neighborhood, having to do with pride in home ownership. For many residents of Bedford-Stuyvesant, this was the first opportunity that their family had to buy real estate in New York City. For many of them, and the older residents, and you guys, I'm sure you've learned about redlining and staring and all those issues of the past. But for many of the older residents, they bought their house. They saved. They bought their house with cash. If they were from the Caribbean, they bought their house with something that we call SUSU, which is a trust-based saving mechanism whereby each person contributes to the pot. There are 10 people, and each person contributes to the pot every month, and the first person takes it, and it keeps going around, and after 10, if it's 10 people, after 10 months or 10 weeks, everybody is paid out. So they they bought their houses the old-fashioned way, through hard work and not with mortgages or any other kind of vehicle. Or if there was a mortgage, it was a mortgage held by the previous homeowner, and usually at predatory rates, or a deed in lieu mortgage where the previous homeowner could just take back the house, or they never got the deed. For the few people I spoke to who actually got a mortgage, the banks held the deed for the 15, 20, 30 years that it took them to pay it off. So for them, it was about saving and protecting something that they worked really hard on. It wasn't about, and at the same time, our zoning was changed, so it was really about protecting, preserving the character of the neighborhood. And a lot of people don't really think about how the built environment informs how they live. We sort of think about the suburban lifestyle as opposed to the city lifestyle. But when you live in a neighborhood like Bed-Stuy, where there are front stoops, the way you interact, how you meet your neighbors, I met all my neighbors on my front stoop. And it's sort of, we come from front porch communities. Most of us are from the South or from the Caribbean, and the front porch is where you meet somebody. And they're the people who you'll never invite onto the porch, and they're those people who will come onto the porch and eventually into your homes. So that's the kind of environment you live in. And when you change that built environment, you change how you communicate with the people around you. So for us, again, it was about protecting our neighborhood and protecting our investment, or personal and family investments in the neighborhood. We have people who, at the Stuyvesant Heights extension hearing, we had folks talking about the fact that their grandfather bought the house in 1938, and they're still there, and that they stayed in Bed-Stuy and took care of their family there, and how important it was that they had that property, because it allowed them now to send the first child in the family to college, because it's part of the wealth of that family. So early on, from the beginning, everyone was pretty much on board. We had the real estate folks come in, so our testimony or hearing at LPC was kind of contentious. And personally, I was a little affronted by the whole thing because REBNY usually sends a representative of their own in to testify. And what they did was come in and speak to every single, we have a group of ministers who meet, and had a meeting with the ministers in Bedford-Stuyvesant to tell them of the evils of landmarking, which left me getting on the phone and calling like 20 ministers to have a conversation about this. But 2 of them did come in and testify, and at our hearing, the only people opposing testimony for Bedford were for people from outside the district who were brought in by the real estate board to testify against us. So that's been our experience. We're now working on a few other districts. We're hoping that this administration will sort of give us a little leeway, but even getting to LPC for us was very difficult. We spent, it's 7 years, and we can look at districts on the Upper West Side who put in their request for evaluation went in at the same time we did, and theirs was done in 2 or 3 years. I mean, there are other issues there as far as money and the support that they have, but for communities like Bedford-Stuyvesant, where there is not a lot of wealth, the process can become very painstaking and very difficult because we don't have the resources to hire a staff, to have people on the ground. This is a solely volunteer effort. Unlike, and I love Andrew dearly from the Greenwich Village Society of Historic Preservation, but I don't have the resources that Andrew has, and I don't have the resources that Stuyvesant West has, Landmarks West has. So for us, it's a neighborhood effort, not just myself, but people on the ground on every block.
Claudette, that's terrific. Thank you so much. Simeon from the Historic Districts Council gave help to Claudette, and you give help to a lot of historic districts, obviously.
Yeah.
So you can give us the bird's eye perspective of what's going on recently with controversies.
Terrific. As Rick said, I represent the Historic Districts Council with a citywide advocate for New York's historic neighborhoods. Our principal constituencies over 500 neighborhood-based volunteer groups like Claudette's who are interested in trying to preserve the physical character of their neighborhoods and who work with them through strategic advice, advocacy, and technical expertise. Now, before I get into the controversy, I want to sort of highlight one of the things that Claudette had just said, which is that the Bedford-Stuyvesant Historic District expansion effort started in the early 90s. Now, it's very important for you all to understand that there are sort of 2 phases of community-based preservation efforts in New York City. The first is what happens before the Landmarks Commission actually hears you, decides to move on you, and then it's what happens afterwards. And like all city processes, most of the work gets done before the agency decides to move. Valerie had mentioned something very important, which is there is no way to force the Landmarks Commission to actually have a hearing. This is true. You can't legally do it. I've had many, many people and a number of board members attempt to do this, and you just can't. So what needs to happen is you need to organize, you need to plead your case, you need to attempt to exert whatever kind of inchoate community pressure and political pressure on the agency to do its job. But that decision to do its job is really the agency's decision. Now, in the Bedford-Stuyvesant case, they decided to move forward with an expanded historic district in the early 1990s, and they calendared it, which is what Valerie had mentioned. Once the agency calendars something, that is the beginning of the official landmark process, and there is at this moment, no end to that process. It is a decision for the agency to say, hey, this is a stake in the ground, we're seriously looking at this, and let us go through our process. Now, when the de Blasio administration came in, there was, and now I can get the thing.
Okay, here you go. Here's your clicker.
Here's my clicker.
Yeah,
And
I
he'll
think-
give you a view of what you may be scrolling through.
Oh, cool.
But I'll crane my head out.
No, this is Valerie's stuff. What?
Yeah,
Yeah.
just keep going. Those are,
Tell me when I'm there.
yeah. What you're seeing while he's getting there are buildings in historic districts.
Back.
All useless.
Forward. Okay. We can do this, really. These old rooms, it's not like I've got a thing in front of me, right? They suck, huh? Anyway, so what happens is that the agency calendars properties, and then it goes through a process. Now, recently, when the new administration came in, when the de Blasio administration came in, there had been, for reasons I don't have the time or the energy to go into, a backlog of properties, which included, for example, the Bedford Historic District, which had been heard 4 years ago and had not been acted upon, and approximately 95 individual properties that had been heard or had been calendared. In many cases, it had public hearings, but the agency, for a number of reasons, had never actually acted upon. This was just this had been this situation had been building for decades. Every administration, every new landmarks chair who comes in would look at the backlog and say, this is not good public policy. We need to fix it. And in fact, under Mayor Bloomberg, Chair Tierney, who was the longest serving landmarks commissioner, had gone through this backlog and gotten a lot of them off the record by either acting upon them or removing them from the calendar. The new chair decided in a moment of determination that she was going to take all of these off the calendar, remove them from consideration, and then maybe revisit them. It was an unclear public process. My organization and my friends in the preservation community said this is not an acceptable way of doing things, that these were all placed on for consideration by previous landmarks commissions, by previous politicians, by community action, and they all deserve to have a new hearing. One thing led to another, and in fact, the Landmarks Commission decided to hold hearings on all 95 properties, re-hold hearings on those properties, and give the public and politicians an opportunity, and other stakeholders and owners, an opportunity to say why these things are significant, why these properties are significant, why they should be landmarks, and why they shouldn't be landmarks. Today in the New York Times online, and tomorrow in the hard copy, the architecture critic Michael Kimmelman actually writes about this if you go and look at it, and he does a very good job of explaining some of the issues. Now, I thought, because I was given the task of controversies, that I would give you some sense of this, and it's important, actually, to sort of look at the buildings, because when you're talking about land use, when you're talking about landmarks, we can quickly get really, really lost in the weeds. We start talking about transferable development rights, property rights, rates per square inch, how many percentages. At the end of the day, it is a visual field. We're talking about physical objects, and it's important to look at these buildings. So, starting with 65 Schofield Street, which I believe should be all the way to your right, that's a Civil War era house. It's connected to important families. It's on City Island in the Bronx, forgive me. It's connected to important families who have settled the area, and it's a remarkable survivor. It's from the 1860s, and that really sort of shows this sort of New England fishing village development of City Island. Next to it, to its left, would be that's the First Presbyterian Church of Williams Bridge. That was my typo, which is in the Bronx, not Brooklyn. There are no landmarks in the area of Williams Bridge. And this is really an outstanding architectural building in a frankly undistinguished area. This is one of those small L landmarks that would be a real loss to the area. People say, where do you live? You're like, oh, by that church. And everyone knows it, right? Now, below the First Presbyterian Church is the Coney Island Pumping Station. Actually designed by Irwin Chanin. Chanin is a very important Art Deco architect in New York City. There's the Chanin building named after him on Lexington Avenue in the 50s. It's unusual. It was an unusual city commission by this major architect. And it's also an outstanding example of modern industrial architecture. It was a pumping station. Actually, it was developed because of fires in Coney Island. They had cruddy water pressure. The city said, you keep burning down. This is no good. We need to put some investment during the WPA, during the Depression, into getting water pressure so this part of the city doesn't burn down. Side note, I went to a junior high school right next to this building, and frankly, the area is an architectural desert. This is the only thing worthwhile in that area. Then next to that is 183, 195 Broadway, which is, it's a cast iron building. There's a whole mess of cast iron buildings. New York City does have the largest collection of cast iron buildings in America, but that's in Manhattan. That's the Soho Cast Iron Historic District. Cast iron used to be used quite a lot in New York City, in industrial buildings particularly. There are only 4 cast iron buildings left in Brooklyn, okay? This is one of them. It's in perfect condition. It is really quite glorious. Again, something that would be a real loss if it was gone. It's being run by the successor company who built it. Okay, did that work? Did I shift? Oh, excellent. Okay, now we should be looking at Greenwood Cemetery.
Greenwood Cemetery.
Okay, now Greenwood Cemetery. All you all know Greenwood Cemetery? All right. Greenwood Cemetery, Civil War, 1838, second rural cemetery in America, almost as big as Prospect Park. It's 480 acres, Prospect Park is 523. It helped inspire the park's movement. Now, it's beautiful. I recommend everybody to go out immediately right after this class and go look at Greenwood. It's a nice day out. It's filled with great architecture, great sculpture, many, many important people. Here's the issue, though. Is landmarks regulation the way to actually regulate Greenwood? Greenwood is a cemetery. It's a working cemetery. Their administration are dedicated to its history. They got it nationally recognized. The question of whether or not the Landmarks Preservation Commission is the appropriate tool to regulate the digging of new graves and new interments is one that is kind of questionable. Now, we actually, my organization, which is pro-landmark, actually said, we don't think that this should be a landmark. We think that there are a number of buildings, chapel buildings, outbuildings, guardhouses that could use the additional regulation and just make sure that you don't have a moment of foolishness and knock anything down. But the building itself might not be worthy. It is worthy, but it might not be appropriate for designation. Below Greenwood would be St. Barbara's Roman Catholic Church, which is in Williamsburg, the kind of corner of Greenpoint, Williamsburg. It's glorious. It has been on landmark. It's been on lists to be designated because of its architectural exuberance since the 1950s. I mean, this is just an obvious. Like you look at it, you're like, whoa! I don't want that to go away. This really is something that kind of inspires the neighborhood and informs the neighborhood. Kitty corner from that, the Holy Trinity Cathedral, aka the Ukrainian Church in Exile. Same architects. This is right across the Williamsburg Bridge. If you ever take the Williamsburg Bridge and you're kind of caught in traffic or right by that, that's that. This is actually, in addition to a small little piece of Beaux Arts design, it was done by somebody who was a graduate of the McKim, Mead & White architecture firm. McKim, Mead & White are the gold standard in Beaux Arts architecture in New York. It is actually a wonderful use of adaptive reuse. It was originally designed as a courthouse. Actually, it was originally designed as a bank. Then it became a courthouse. Then, since 1961, it's been a church. So in all that time, it continues to fill a civic notion. It's again, architecturally distinguished and has been shown for about 100 years to continue to reuse and serve as a function. Below that is the Lady Deborah Moody House. Raise your hands if you know who Lady Deborah Moody is. Right, exactly. Lady Deborah Moody is one of the first female landowners in New York, in probably the United States. Definitely, she helped form one of the I'm gonna mess this up. Six towns of Brooklyn, 5 of them were Dutch, 1 of them was English. That was her, she was an Anabaptist. It's down in Gravesend. This was long known to be called Lady Moody's house. Lady Moody was 17th century. This is not a 17th century house. This is actually an early 18th century house, which is on the site of Lady Moody's house. It is very rare in New York City. There are approximately a dozen Dutch-American farmhouses left in Brooklyn, and approximately 18 in all of New York City that still exist from the 18th century. This is one of the few that was actually not moved from the site. And is very important for its historic association with Lady Moody, even though it might not be Lady Moody's house itself. It still is 220 years old and standing, and informs you of Brooklyn didn't always look like what it looks like now. It looked like that once. Okay, moving right along. we have got 2 Oliver Street, all the way on the far right, which is just wicked old. It's down in Chinatown. It's from the 1830s. It's connected to a landmark property, one of the federals. There are very few federal buildings left as a typography. Below that is the Chester Allen Author House on 26th Street in Lexington, better known as Kalustyan's, which is an amazing Middle Eastern grocery and fantastic falafel. It has been Kalustyan's for 40 some odd years. Well worth stopping by. The Chester Allen Author House is the Chester Allen author. Everyone knows who he is, right? President of the United States. This is the only site in New York City which he owned it. He actually, yeah, okay, I'm gonna fast. He owned it. He was actually made president there, and yet it still remains. Then you've got the Bound Street House in Flushing, another outstanding landmark church. And above that is Bergdorf Goodman, which we will probably address later, because that's a very important thing. Finally, 2 other buildings, one in Queens, that's the Spanish Towers Homes, which are part of the Jackson Heights Historic District, though it was never part of the Historic District. It's very characteristic of the district, the Mediterranean style. And then finally, 566 Arthur Kill Road, which was from 1852, again, an early 19th century house in Staten Island that could use a little love, but still is perfectly intact.
Thank you so much, Simeon. That was really wonderful to get a sense of what's at stake here. David, could you close us out? We end at 2, I should say, and so and it would be great if we could have some time for audience to talk, ask some questions. Could you talk a little bit about the larger city context here and how the city balances the various goals that the city has to take care of?
Sure. First, let me say the old adage that last but not least doesn't really apply here, because of all the speakers here, I know the least about landmarks and historic preservation. And when Ingrid Ellen from the Furman Center asked me if I'd speak, I said, you know, spent 15 years on the Planning Commission, don't know much about landmarks. And she said, well, that in itself is kind of interesting. And I think that's sort of the point I want to make overall, which is that in New York City today, I think we have a system in which the Planning Department, the Planning Commission, and the Landmarks Preservation Commission sort of operate in their own spheres, and the interaction between the two in terms of planning for our city is fairly minimal and occasional and awkward sometimes. On the other hand, maybe that's as it should be, in the sense that I wouldn't want Landmarks Preservation Commission to have to itself engage in the kind of balancing of costs and benefits that you described, Rod. And that, it seems to me, is not its function. And for it to pull punches in terms of making determinations of significance with respect to the kinds of buildings that you just saw, I think would be a mistake in terms of a structure and a process of government. And people like Ed Glazer at Harvard, you know, have created these interesting thought experiments about artificial devices to control and restrain the LPC by, for example, putting a cap on the number of landmark buildings that can be landmarked at any given time, and a requirement that each and every time a new landmark designation is made, there should be a subtraction from the list. And those are interesting thought experiments, but I would suggest that's not the way we would want to proceed. So given that, however, the question is, you know, how in fact, and this is really getting to your point, do we balance the values of historic preservation against other goals, and under what circumstances do we find that preservation values might be outweighed by more compelling interests in a given case? You know, there are jurisdictions around the country that do this, and I'm not a student of it particularly, but DC has a provision in its code that basically says the mayor appoints an official who has the right to override the determinations of the local Historic Preservation Commission for buildings of special merit, and there's a whole definition of what special merit means. In other words, a new building of special merit that might result in the demolition of a historic structure, which is defined as a plan or building having significant benefits to the District of Columbia or to the community, or other benefits having a high priority for community services. So they have something like that. Whether it works, whether it's democratic, whether it's the right approach, I don't know. But there are jurisdictions who do this and try to build in some sort of a safety valve into their system. New York, I think, is very unsuccessful in doing that. There is a provision of the city charter, section 3020, if I can find it here, which says basically that when LPC designates or an individual landmark or creates a historic district, it shall submit the report to the commission, and the commission files, holds a public hearing and submits to the city council a report with respect to the relation of any such designation, whether of a historic district or a landmark, to the zoning resolution, projected public improvements, and any plans for the development, growth, improvement, or renewal of the area involved. So if you look at that, you sort of realize that the drafters of this provision somehow thought that the City Planning Commission would perform the kind of function I described, of looking at the relationship of the proposal to the overall growth and development of the city, and where there's conflict, to identify it and to recommend changes or other action by the city council. So on paper, it looks great if you're thinking about some sort of balanced structure of government. In practice, it doesn't work at all. And there are a number of reasons for this. One of them, I think, is simply that I don't think the Planning Commission has the analytics to actually evaluate the relationship between a historic district and plans for the city as a whole, or even its own plans. This came up in 2011 when, well, let's go back in time. In 2001, City Planning and the City Council approved the downtown Brooklyn rezoning for a very vast area in downtown Brooklyn for the redevelopment of the area and really to promote its growth for commercial and residential development through a series of zoning actions. Flash forward to 2011, the LPC comes forward with a Brooklyn skyscraper district with 21 buildings in it in the same area overlapping with the zoning special district. It comes to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission, I would say, had no idea of how to evaluate this. The Real Estate Board was furious. The preservationist groups, of course, were advocating for it, but there was no real framework within which to evaluate the consequences of this. And at the end of the day, as it has done repeatedly over the years, the Planning Commission simply said there's no conflict between the two. One member of the Planning Commission, in her sort of dissent, said, basically, I'm going to repeat the points I've made on previous occasions. The City Planning Department and the City Planning Commission should not give our power away. And I think that's where we are today, which is we don't really have an effective mechanism. Part of the reason also, I think, lies with the fact that both the Planning Commission and the Planning Department and the LPC are mayoral agencies. And to create a structure on paper in which one mayoral agency basically makes a decision or determination that the actions of the other are inappropriate or somehow detrimental is not really going to happen. And so there's a problem here. How to solve these kinds of issues if we really do believe that there are situations where historic districting has detrimental effects in terms of housing production or other things, is it really an open issue in New York? And I think it's to the credit of organizations like the Furman Center and academics on both sides of the debate that they're bringing forward the analysis which can inform the questions, and perhaps that analysis and that examination of the issues will lead to some kind of a structural reform at some point in time. Right now, I think it's muddled. I think it's haphazard. And even though the City Council has the authority to turn down a designation, it doesn't do so on the basis of the kind of considered planning criteria that you'd like to see in thinking these kinds of issues through. And there's also actually a legal ambiguity about the authority of the council to introduce into its own determinations considerations that are unrelated to the significance itself, and that grows out of some litigation some years ago. So I think the answer in a nutshell is, on paper it looks great, in reality it doesn't really exist, and the question is, what, if anything, we should do about it?
Thank you so much, David. That's terrific. I mean, terrific in the sense that you're delivering bad news eloquently. Now, we have 10 minutes, and then you guys got to rush off to class. And what I'd just like to do is turn the microphone on the floor. There should be a microphone on the floor. Michael back there has got a microphone. Oh, there's 2 microphones. And I'd like to invite the audience to ask questions about this process and the general policies that surround it. This is a great opportunity to talk to some people who know about as much as anyone can about this process. And so just raise your hand, they'll bring you a microphone. The reason why we want, here, there's Eli right over here. The reason why we want to speak in the microphone is that it'll be recorded for posterity in the spirit of historic preservation.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate hearing a diverse set of remarks about each of your respective areas of expertise. I am a new New Yorker. I grew up in Philadelphia, in a pretty old house actually, and so I appreciate this understanding of historic character. As Rick mentioned, this is a very expensive city, and I recently moved to Hoboken, largely in part because of the cost of rent around here. Now, I have 2 quick questions so that we can hit as many things as we need, one of which is it sounds like there is a very haphazard process. I really appreciate David's remarks, which was also iterated on this side as well, that is not clean how things move through this. So what are the chances that the structure that we have today is the structure that we will have in 10, 20 years, something like that? Is there any real consideration of that? And is there any appetite for a more totalistic accommodation of other types of city planning interests on the commission, or is it just a total loggerheads, no? It sounds structurally like it is, but yeah, those 2.
David, you want-
I don't see anything currently on that horizon, and I think it's a muddle, and the inclination of government is to muddle through. What you do see, I think, is different administrations taking slightly different approaches towards how they manage conflict behind the curtain, and how they deal with the various commissioners and try to address areas of potential conflict. But that's not necessarily the way we would want to see it happen. But that does happen. And there's a difference between this administration and the prior administration in terms of how that works. And that's sort of the informal way of dealing with these issues. In terms of formal structure, formal process, I don't see anything really on the horizon.
The fact that LPC does not have a strict guideline as to what's designatable is important because it's an evolving society. We're changing every day. So, if you put it has to be, built between this year and this year to be of value. If something is built later that is of value, then we can't designate it. So it has to be flexible. It has to be able to incorporate new ideas and new types of design within it. As far as going back to now, what's designated, getting LPC to designate something, I think a lot of that's political. I think a lot of that has to do with the administration that's in place. You look at, and maybe it's because I'm black I'm saying this, but you look at Bedford-Stuyvesant or Harlem, where we had 20 years waiting for something, 40 years waiting for something to move. A lot of the 95 properties are outside of New York City. They're in lower income or poorer neighborhoods. So I think a lot of who gets the attention, and it's money as well, because the village has Andrew Berman. Bed-Stuy has me and some other people who have jobs. So there are all these social, economic, political things that kind of get muddled into this whole conversation.
Also, I'd just like to insert a little bit of facts which we've gotten from the Furman Center, who's currently doing a study of where we are now after 50 years of landmarking. And one of the interesting things that Mr. Glazer doesn't really talk about is the fact that yes, it's 3% of property in New York City is overseen by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Over 10% of the population of New York City lives in that 3% of space. So I think that actually the landmark districts are doing okay by housing people.
Hi. We've talked about obligations that are imposed on property owners when their property is designated. So I wanted to ask what happens when the property owner says, I simply don't have the money to maintain my property to the standards that you require? And number two, since these are obligations imposed on citizens, what types of recourses or annulment possibilities does the property owner have against the designation?
They're not a lot of, there's not a lot of recourse. The Landmarks Commission can't force you to do anything unless your building is literally falling down or water is pouring into it. What they can do is and this happens a lot in residential districts, when you want to replace your windows, you will go to the Landmarks Commission and you will find that what the landmarks window that they will approve is, in a row house, it's a very expensive window. It has to be a wood window. It has to have certain profiles. And so many times when people find this out, sometimes they just walk away. They don't replace their windows because they can't afford to. There are some grant programs, but they're pretty limited. And it's definitely expensive to be in a landmark district. Regulation process takes time, even when you don't have to go to a public hearing. And the requirements in terms of materials and the quality of the work that has to be done is higher.
I just, for the other regulations, so you had mentioned keeping your building structurally sound. Those are regulations that you're gonna have anyway, okay? If a chunk of your cornice is falling off, whether you're a landmark or not, DOB or somebody's gonna come and have you scaffold that building or skirt that building somehow. For the average person, though, I think, especially like in a brownstone district like mine, it's window replacement, you know, or painting. Yes, the cost of the windows may be higher, but you're going to look at it, you know, what's your return on investment? You know, my house had the same wood windows since 1865, and they're being retrofitted, and they'll be there for another 100 years. So, you know, if we look at the course of the wood windows over the life of the house, it's actually cheaper than getting vinyl ones and replacing them every 10 years. So, you know, we have to look at costs over the life of the project and not just what it's costing me up front. And not that it will add to the sales value, but it's a more aesthetically appealing house. So when you go to sell it, you're gonna do a better job than the guy next door with the white vinyl windows.
I think we have time for one more question, because I see we have 2 minutes before people have to scuttle off to classes. So, one more?
One quick question in terms of like alternate solutions. Is there any thought about, you know, when there's like one landmark that's kind of like on an island, sort of not an island, but like literally surrounded by other structures, to take it and place it in sort of a museum, so to preserve it, but also to enable more development in those areas? I'm talking about, of course, if there's an organic structure like Bet's Stew, that wouldn't make sense to take out one structure and put it somewhere else. But I wonder if there's any thought to that.
That at one point was actually, or earlier in American history, was a standard way of dealing with it, particularly when you're dealing with a house that's a shrine. Many of the historic house museums in New York City have been picked up and moved. By and large, however, I think that's very important to keep things in situ, because that gives you a better sense of the context. Unlike Indiana Jones, we don't believe that everything should belong in a museum.
Landmarks actually has a great deal of difficulty in approving a relocation of an individual landmark, because it's not just that they have to give a permit, they would have to amend the entire designation, and that would have to go through the process with the city council and the public hearings, because you would be changing the landmark site.
I think the other thing about this is this question of the individual landmark that's not in a historic district, you know, is addressed in the zoning to some extent through what's called 7479, which is a provision that allows for the transfer of the unused development rights on the landmark site to adjacent properties. And that was designed to address some of what you're getting at, not exactly, but it recognized that situation and distinguished between that situation and the situation when a building is in a historic district surrounded by other buildings in the historic district and not entitled to transfer its development rights in that way.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists for coming in today. It's extraordinarily informative for me, and I want to give them a round of applause.